The telegram had been brief. Widow, 32, seeks honest partnership. No pretense. Thomas Whitfield, 24 and alone on 800 Montana acres, had written back the same day. When the train from Illinois pulled into Billings that March morning in 1893, he stood on the platform, clutching wildflowers he'd picked before dawn. The woman who stepped down moved with the careful precision of someone twice the age he'd imagined. Silver, threading through dark hair, pulled back in a practical bun, lines framing eyes that had seen more winters than his. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind off the Yellowstone Valley carried the smell of snow that hadn't yet decided to fall. It pushed against the depot platform, rattling the telegraph wires overhead and lifting dust from between the planks where boots had worn the wood smooth. The morning train sat breathing steam into cold air, its engine ticking as it cooled, while passengers shuffled down the steps with bags and bundled children and the tired faces of people who'd been sitting too long. Margaret Donnelly came last. She took the conductor's hand for balance, but didn't lean on it, stepping down with both feet before releasing his grip. Her traveling coat was wool, well made but not new, buttons fastened to the collar against the wind. She carried a single carpet bag herself, waving off the porter who'd started toward her with a cart. Behind her, still on the train, sat a trunk that had crossed half the country in the baggage car, holding everything she'd kept after selling the rest. The platform wasn't crowded. A family reunion happened near the depot door, grandmother clutching grandson like she'd worried he wouldn't be real. Two men in cattlemen's coats stood smoking, discussing prices without looking at each other. A woman in a green shawl hurried past with her head down, late for something that mattered only to her. Thomas Whitfield stood near the water tower. He was taller than his letters had suggested, broad through the shoulders in the way men get when they work with their hands from boyhood. His coat was clean but showed repair at one elbow. The hat he wore had been good once, probably his father's, shaped by weather and use into something that fit him now. He held something in his left hand, keeping it low against his leg, where the wind wouldn't take it. Margaret saw him before he saw her. She recognized him not from description but from posture, the way he stood watching the train like he expected disappointment, but hoped anyway. Weight on one leg, patient, but not relaxed. She'd known men who stood like that. Her late husband had been one of them, back when they were young, and nothing had broken yet. She walked toward him, bag in hand, boots solid on the platform. She didn't hurry. The train wasn't leaving for another 20 minutes, and she'd learned long ago that rushing toward a thing didn't change what it was. He noticed her when she was 10 feet away. His eyes went to her face first, held there a moment, then dropped to the carpet bag back up. She watched him understand, watched the hope rearrange itself into something more complicated. He was young, younger than she'd let herself imagine when reading his letters. The sun behind him caught the edge of his jaw, barely shadowed with stubble, skin that hadn't yet learned to line. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. It wasn't a question. She knew. "Ma'am." He cleared his throat. You're Margaret Donnelly?" "I am." He looked at her again, longer this time. She didn't flinch from it. She'd been looked at before, been measured and found wanting, or found suitable, or found invisible, depending on who was doing the looking. This young man looked like he was trying to solve an equation he hadn't been given all the numbers for. "Your letter said 32, he said. It did. The wind pushed between them. Margaret shifted her bag to the other hand, but didn't set it down. From the locomotive, someone shouted about freight. A door slammed. "How old are you?" Thomas asked. His voice was quiet, not accusing, just trying to find solid ground. 68, Margaret said. "This June." She didn't explain, didn't apologize. The number sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. She watched him work through it, watched him try to reconcile the person in front of him with the idea he'd carried for 3 weeks since her last letter arrived. The flowers in his hand were prairie roses, early bloomers, pink going white at the edges. They were already wilting in the wind. "You lied," he said. "I misrepresented," Margaret replied. "There's a difference, though not one that matters much to you right now." "Why?" It was the question she'd expected, the question she'd answered to herself 100 times on the train ride west, sitting up in the passenger car because she couldn't afford a sleeper, watching the country roll past in shades of brown and green and endless grey sky. "Because honest answers don't get read," she said. "They get set aside for younger pages." Thomas looked down at the flowers, then at the platform, then somewhere past her shoulder toward the mountains that sat blue and distant beyond the town. When he looked back, something in his face had closed. "I can't," he said. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Donnelly, but I can't. I need someone who can." He didn't finish, didn't need to. Margaret knew the rest. Someone who can bear children. Someone who can work 30 years beside you. Someone who won't be old before you're 40. Someone who matches the picture in your head of what a wife should be. "I understand," she said, and she did. She'd expected it, if she was honest with herself. Expected it enough that she'd already planned for the return fare, had the money sewn into the lining of her coat where no one would find it if she had to sleep rough. But expecting a thing and standing in front of it turned out to be different animals. "There's a boarding house on 2nd Street, Thomas said. He was trying to be decent about it. "Mrs. Halloran runs it. She's fair. I can give you directions, or I can walk you there if—" "I'll find it," Margaret said. She didn't say it unkindly, just a fact. She'd found her way through worse than an unfamiliar Montana town. Thomas nodded. He looked at the flowers in his hand like he'd forgotten he was holding them, then held them out toward her, an odd, formal gesture that didn't quite land right. "I picked these," he said. "Before I knew." "You should. You can have them anyway." Margaret looked at the roses. They were pretty in the way wild things are, unpretentious and brief. She thought about taking them, thought about what it would mean to walk into town carrying flowers from a man who'd just turned her away, thought about how the boarding house proprietor would look at them and at her and make assumptions. "Keep them for someone else," she said. Thomas pulled his hand back. For just a moment something like shame crossed his face, but it passed. He was young enough that shame still felt temporary. "I am sorry," he said again. "So am I," Margaret replied. She meant it. Not sorry that she'd come, necessarily, but sorry that hope was such a stubborn thing, still capable of building itself up even when you knew better. Sorry that loneliness made fools of everyone, eventually. Sorry that this boy, and he was a boy, really, despite the ranch and the responsibility and the worn hat, had to learn today that life didn't deliver what you ordered. Thomas touched the brim of his hat, a gesture toward manners, toward the forms people kept, even when the content had spilled out. Then he turned and walked back down the platform toward the street, boots heavy on the wood, flowers still clutched in one hand. Margaret watched him go, watched him pass the smoking cattleman and the family reunion and the woman in the green shawl coming back the other way. Watched him turn the corner past the depot and disappear into the grid of Billings streets. The train hissed behind her. The conductor called for final boarding. Margaret turned and looked at it, at the open door and the steps and the promise of going back. Back to Illinois. Back to her sister's house, where she was tolerated but not wanted. Back to the charity of distant cousins and the church ladies who spoke to her like she was already halfway to the grave. She'd sold everything to buy the ticket west, furniture that had been her grandmother's, the good dishes, the quilts she'd made during years when her hands were steadier. She'd kept only what fit in the trunk and the bag, only what mattered or couldn't be replaced. The conductor looked at her. "Ma'am, you boarding?" Margaret picked up her carpet bag. "No," she said. "I need my trunk brought down." He nodded and signaled to the porter. Margaret stood and waited while they hauled it out, a battered leather and wood box with her initials stamped on the lid, M.E.D., the E for Elizabeth, a name she'd stopped using after her mother died. They set it on the platform with a thud. "You need help with that?" the porter asked. "I'll manage," Margaret said. She gave him a coin anyway, because he'd asked, instead of assuming. The train pulled out 5 minutes later, gathering speed as it rolled east, back toward the place she'd come from. Margaret stood and watched it go until the sound faded and the smoke thinned, and there was nothing left but the empty track and the wind. The depot clerk came out from the ticket window. He was older, maybe 50, with spectacles and the careful expression of a man who'd watched a lot of people arrive and leave and tried not to have opinions about either. "Next eastbound's Thursday afternoon," he said. "You can store that trunk inside if you're staying in town." "Thank you," Margaret said. "I'll keep it with me." He looked at her, at the trunk, at the carpet bag. "Mrs. Halloran's place is 6 blocks north," he said. "She doesn't take monthlies, but she's got rooms by the week." Margaret nodded. She'd already decided she wasn't going to Mrs. Halloran's. She'd spent enough of her life in rooms rented by the week, in places where landladies watched your comings and goings and made judgments over breakfast. She'd come west for something different, even if it hadn't worked out the way she'd imagined. She bent down and gripped the trunk handle. It was heavy, packed with winter clothes and summer dresses and the few books she couldn't part with, and the cast-iron skillet her mother had carried from Pennsylvania. Too heavy to carry far, but she could drag it. She'd dragged worse. The clerk watched her. "You sure you don't want help?" "I'm sure," Margaret said. She pulled the trunk off the platform edge, let it thud onto the dirt street, then dragged it behind her as she walked. It scraped and bumped over the uneven ground, leaving a shallow furrow in the dust. Her shoulder ached within a block. Her hands, even through the gloves, felt the strain. She didn't stop. Buildings spread out around her like most western towns, wide streets, low buildings, everything built with the assumption that space was cheaper than ambition. The bank stood 2 stories, proud of itself. The mercantile had painted letters on the window advertising dry goods and hardware. A saloon called the Stockman sat dark at this hour, doors closed, no sound from inside. Further down, a church with a white steeple reached toward nothing in particular. People noticed her. Of course they did. A woman alone, dragging a trunk through town in the middle of a Tuesday morning. Too old to be a new bride, too well dressed to be destitute. She felt their eyes from windows and doorways, felt the questions forming that they were too polite or too indifferent to ask aloud. She made it 3 blocks before she had to stop. Her breath came hard, and her hands were shaking. She set the trunk down and straightened, pressing one hand to the small of her back, where the muscles had started to knot. The wind had picked up, colder now, pushing against her like it wanted her to turn around. "Ma'am." The voice came from behind her. Margaret turned. A man stood there, 30 or so, with a weathered face and dark hair under a battered hat. He wore work clothes, canvas pants, and a wool shirt, boots that had seen a lot of miles. He didn't smile, but he didn't look unfriendly either, just observant. "You look like you're hauling more than luggage," he said. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "That depends," she said. "Are you offering help or making conversation?" "Help," he said. "Conversation's extra." She studied him. He had the look of someone who worked outdoors, hands calloused, skin lined from sun and wind. Not a drifter, his clothes were too clean, too cared for. Not a townsman either, he stood like someone more comfortable with animals than people. "I don't need charity," Margaret said. "Didn't offer it," he replied. "But I've got a wagon around the corner, and that trunk looks like it's winning." Margaret glanced down at the trunk, then back at him. "What's your name?" "Daniel Carver," he said. "I run cattle south of here. Came in for supplies." "Margaret Donnelly." He nodded once, acknowledgement without ceremony. "Where are you headed, Mrs. Donnelly?" That was the question, wasn't it? Where was she headed? She'd had a destination when she stepped off the train, a young rancher and a new life, and a plan that had lasted all of 15 minutes. Now she had a trunk and a carpet bag, and a town she didn't know, and no particular place to be. "I haven't decided yet," she said. Daniel Carver looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "My wagon's at the livery. You're welcome to set that trunk in it while you figure it out. No obligation." Margaret considered. She'd learned to be wary of men offering help, learned that kindness often came with strings attached, visible or otherwise. But she'd also learned to recognize the difference between a man looking for something and a man just doing what seemed right. Daniel Carver had the posture of the latter, direct, uncomplicated, not waiting for gratitude. "All right," she said. He bent down and lifted the trunk like it weighed nothing, settled it against his shoulder. "This way," he said, and started walking. Margaret picked up her carpetbag and followed. They walked in silence, turning the corner onto a side street where the buildings were older, wood-sided and weathered. The livery sat at the end, a large barn with open doors and the smell of hay and horses drifting out. Daniel set the trunk in the back of a flatbed wagon, settled it against a pile of grain sacks. The wagon was old, but well-maintained, wood-oiled, wheels sound. 2 horses stood hitched and patient, not bothered by much. "You can leave it here as long as you need," Daniel said. "I'm not heading back till tomorrow." "Thank you," Margaret said. He nodded. "You hungry?" The question surprised her. "What?" "There's a place across the street that makes decent stew," he said. "You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday." Margaret realized he was right. She'd had coffee at dawn when the train stopped in Laurel, nothing since. Her stomach felt hollow, and the cold had worked its way deeper than she'd noticed. "I can pay for my own meal," she said. "Didn't ask you to," Daniel replied. "Just asked if you were hungry." She looked at him, trying to read intent, trying to see what he wanted. But his face showed nothing except mild patience and the kind of worn-down practicality that comes from working hard for not much return. "Yes," Margaret said finally. "I am." They crossed the street to a narrow building with a sign that read, "Cliers in faded paint." Inside, it was warm and dim, smelling of beef and onions and bread. A woman behind the counter nodded at Daniel, glanced at Margaret with curiosity but no judgment. "2 stews," Daniel said. "Coffee." They sat at a table near the window. The stew came in thick bowls, steam rising, chunks of meat and potato and carrot in dark broth. Margaret ate slowly, letting the heat work its way through her. Daniel ate without talking, the comfortable silence of someone used to his own company. Halfway through the meal, Margaret said, "Why are you helping me?" Daniel looked up. "You needed help. That's not a reason most people act on." He shrugged. "Maybe I'm not most people, or maybe you want something." He set down his spoon. "Mrs. Donnelly," he said, "I'm going to be straight with you. I don't want anything except to finish my stew and get back to loading supplies. You looked like you were about to drag that trunk all the way to the next county out of pure stubbornness, and I've got a wagon sitting empty. That's all there is." Margaret believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she'd heard enough lies in her life to recognize the truth when it sat across from her, wearing work clothes and looking tired. "I apologize," she said. "No need," Daniel replied, caution sensible. They finished eating. Daniel paid, waving off Margaret's attempt to contribute. Outside, the wind had shifted, bringing the smell of distant rain. The street was busier now, people moving with purpose, getting things done before weather arrived. "You figure out where you're going yet?" Daniel asked. Margaret looked down the street, at the buildings and the people and the wide Montana sky pressing down on all of it. She thought about the boarding house, about renting a room and waiting for Thursday's train, thought about going back east to her sister's charity and the church lady's pity, thought about the telegram that had brought her here, the lie she'd told, the hope she'd carried all the way from Illinois. "No," she said, "not yet." Daniel nodded. He started to turn away, then stopped. "My ranch is about 12 miles south," he said. "I've got a cabin that's empty. Used to house a hand who moved on last fall. It's not much, but it's dry, and there's a stove. You could stay there while you sort things out. No rent, just keep the place from falling apart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret stared at him. You don't know me. No, he agreed. But you're 68 years old, and you just dragged a trunk 3 blocks rather than ask for help. That tells me enough. It tells you I'm stubborn. Stubborn people survive, Daniel said. I respect that. The offer hung between them, strange and unexpected and more generous than made sense. Margaret turned it over in her mind, looking for the catch, the hidden cost, the thing he wasn't saying. But Daniel Carver just stood there, patient, waiting for an answer without seeming to need a particular one. Why? Margaret asked. Because the cabin's sitting empty, he said. Because you need a place. Because it's the right thing to do, and I was raised to do right things when they're not too difficult. Margaret looked at him. Really, looked. Saw a man who worked hard, who didn't waste words, who offered help like it was ordinary. Saw someone who'd probably been alone long enough to understand what that cost. All right, she said. Thank you. Daniel nodded once. I'll be leaving around dawn tomorrow. Wagon'll be at the livery if you decide to come. He touched his hat brim and walked away, back toward the mercantile, leaving Margaret standing on the sidewalk with her carpet bag and a decision she hadn't expected to have to make. She spent the rest of the day walking. Not going anywhere in particular, just learning the shape of Billings, the way the streets connected, where the respectable ended and the rough began. She found the boarding house on 2nd Street, looked at it from across the road, neat, white paint, flowers in boxes, curtains in the windows. It looked safe, temporary, like all the other rooms she'd rented in all the other towns. By evening, she'd made up her mind. She spent the night on a bench in the depot waiting room. The clerk didn't object, just brought her a blanket when the temperature dropped and told her the stove would stay lit till morning. Margaret dozed more than slept, waking every time someone came or went, her hand on her bag, old habits from years of not quite trusting the world. At dawn, she walked to the livery. Daniel Carver was already there, loading the last of his supplies into the wagon. He saw her coming and nodded. No surprise, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement. Your trunk's still in the back, he said. I know, Margaret replied. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. Daniel settled beside her, took up the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses leaned into their harness, and the wagon rolled forward, wheels crunching on frozen ground. They left Billings as the sun cleared the mountains, painting everything gold and cold. Margaret didn't look back. She'd spent too much of her life looking back. Ahead, the road stretched south into a country she'd never seen, toward a cabin she'd never imagined, with a man she'd known for one day. It wasn't what she'd come for, but it was something, and right now that was enough. The road south followed the river for the first hour, then cut west through grassland that rolled like frozen ocean swells. Daniel Carver drove with the quiet attention of someone who'd made this trip 100 times, reading the ruts and rocks, guiding the horses around the worst of it. Margaret sat beside him, carpetbag at her feet, watching the country open up in ways Illinois had never prepared her for. The sky went on forever. That was the first thing that struck her. No trees to break it, no buildings to frame it, just endless pale blue stretching to horizons so distant they seemed like ideas rather than places. The wind came steady from the west, cold and clean, carrying scents. She didn't have names for sage, maybe, or something older than plants, the smell of stone and distance. They passed a homestead around mid-morning, small house and barn huddled together like they were trying to stay warm. Smoke rose from the chimney. A dog barked once but didn't chase. Daniel raised a hand in greeting, though no one appeared at the windows. "Neighbors?" Margaret asked. First words either of them had spoken since leaving town. "The Sorensens," Daniel said. "Swedes. Been here 3 years. They keep to themselves, mostly. How far to your place?" "Another 2 hours. Maybe less if the road stays dry. Margaret nodded. She'd ridden in enough wagons to know that 2 hours meant different things depending on terrain and weather and the mood of the horses. These two seemed steady, unbothered by the load or the miles. The sun climbed higher but brought no warmth with it. Margaret pulled her coat tighter, glad she'd kept the heavy one instead of selling it with the rest. Her hands inside her gloves were cold, but not numb. She'd known worse. "You always live out here?" she asked after another mile had passed. 5 years, Daniel said. "Bought the land from a man who thought cattle were easier than they are. He learned something different. And you haven't?" He glanced at her, something that might have been amusement touching the corner of his mouth. "I learned before I bought," he said. "My father ran stock in Colorado. I grew up knowing cattle don't care about your plans. What brought you to Montana? Cheaper land, fewer people." He paused. "I don't mind solitude." Margaret understood that. She'd married young to a good man who died slow from something the doctors couldn't name or fix. After he'd gone, she'd discovered she preferred her own company to most others. The world was full of people ready to tell you what you should do, how you should grieve, when you should be over it. Solitude didn't offer advice. "You got family?" Daniel asked. "A sister in Illinois, 2 nephews I've met once each. They're kind enough when we cross paths, but we're strangers who happen to share blood." "That why you came west?" Margaret considered how to answer that. The truth was complicated, tangled up with loneliness and practicality, and the specific kind of desperation that comes from realizing you're a burden to people who love you but don't particularly like you. "I came west because staying east meant shrinking," she said finally, "getting smaller and quieter until I disappeared into someone's back bedroom. This seemed preferable." Daniel nodded. "Even after this morning?" "Especially after this morning," Margaret said. "That boy at the station, he was honest once he saw me. That's more than some people manage." "He left you stranded." "He left me free," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference." They rode in silence after that, the wagon creaking, the horses' hooves finding rhythm on the packed earth. The land changed gradually, rising into low hills, rock breaking through the grass in places like old bones. A hawk circled overhead, riding the wind with its wings spread wide and still. Around noon, Daniel pulled the wagon off the road into the lee of a rock outcrop that broke the wind. He climbed down, reached into the wagon bed, and pulled out a canvas sack. "Not much," he said, "but it'll keep you until supper." Inside were biscuits wrapped in cloth, a chunk of hard cheese, and 2 apples that had seen better days but were still sound. Margaret took a biscuit and half the cheese, left the rest. "You're not eating?" Daniel asked. "I am eating," Margaret said, holding up the biscuit. "I don't need more than this. There's still a long way still to go. I've gone longer on less." He looked at her, then took an apple and bit into it, without arguing further. They ate standing, walking a few steps from the wagon to stretch legs that had gone stiff from sitting. Margaret worked her shoulders, feeling the muscles protest. She wasn't young, and her body reminded her of that fact with increasing frequency, but she wasn't fragile either. She'd hauled water and chopped wood and scrubbed floors too many years to forget how. "The cabin's sound," Daniel said between bites. "Roof doesn't leak, door closes tight, stove draws clean. There's a well about 30 yards out, water's cold but good. You'll need to haul it yourself." "I expected that. I'm not close by," he continued. "My place is about a 1/4 mile east. I'll check on you first few days. Make sure you're settled. But after that I've got work that keeps me occupied. You'll be on your own most of the time." "Mr. Carver," Margaret said, "I've been on my own for 12 years. I'll manage." He studied her face. "I believe you will." They finished eating and climbed back onto the wagon. The horses started forward without needing much encouragement, sensing maybe that they were getting closer to home and feed and rest. The road climbed into the hills, switching back where the grade got steep, following the path of least resistance through a country that didn't give way easy. At the top of a rise, Daniel pulled up and let the horses blow. From here, Margaret could see the valley spread below, a wide bowl of grassland with a creek cutting silver through the middle. Cattle dotted the far slopes, dark shapes against brown grass. To the east, she could make out buildings, barn, house, corrals, all small with distance, but substantial enough to suggest permanence. "That's mine," Daniel said, pointing. Then he shifted his hand slightly south. "Cabin's down there. You can't see it from here, it's tucked into the trees along the creek." Margaret looked where he indicated. She could see the creek, the thin line of cottonwoods that marked its course, but no structure. That seemed right somehow, a place that didn't announce itself. They descended into the valley as the sun started its long slide toward the western mountains. The temperature dropped with the light. Margaret's breath began to fog. She tucked her hands under her arms for warmth. The cabin appeared gradually as they approached, materializing from the landscape like it had been there so long it had become part of the earth itself. Log construction, single room from the look of it, roof of split shakes weathered to grey. A stone chimney rose from one end, no smoke yet but sound. A small, covered porch fronted the door. Behind it, the cottonwoods stood bare-branched and waiting for spring. Daniel drove the wagon right up to the porch steps and set the brake. He climbed down, then reached up to help Margaret. She took his hand, let him steady her as she found her footing. Her legs had stiffened from the ride. "Let me get the stove going first," Daniel said. "Then we'll bring your things in." He went inside. Margaret heard him moving around, the sound of metal on metal, the scrape of a match. She stood on the porch and looked at the valley, spreading away in all directions. Quiet, so much quieter than anywhere she'd been. No wagon traffic, no neighbors calling to each other, no church bells or factory whistles or the 100 small sounds that towns made just by existing. Only wind and the distant creek, and somewhere far off, a cow lowing. Smoke began to rise from the chimney. Daniel came back out, brushing his hands on his pants. "It'll warm up quick," he said. "Stove's been cold for a while, but it's drawing good." Together they unloaded her trunk, Daniel carrying the weight, while Margaret guided it through the door. Inside, the cabin was simple and clean, one room, maybe 15 feet square. The stove sat in the far corner, already beginning to tick with heat. A narrow bed frame with rope supports stood along one wall, no mattress yet. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf with some basic dishes, a window on the south wall, small but real glass. Hooks by the door for coats. Floorboards worn smooth but not rotted. "There's a mattress tick in the shed out back," Daniel said. "I'll fill it with fresh straw before I go. Blankets too, I've got extras you can use." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he interrupted, but not unkindly. "I'm doing it anyway." He went back out. Margaret stood in the center of the room, turning slowly. It smelled of cold and disuse, but underneath that, something else, wood smoke and old coffee, and the particular scent of a place where someone had lived simply and left it clean. She walked to the window, looked out at the creek and the cottonwoods and the long light falling across the grass. This was hers now. Not owned, but hers to occupy. Hers to wake up in and make coffee in and watch the seasons change from. A place where no one would knock on the door to tell her she was in the way. Something in her chest loosened. Daniel came back, carrying a canvas tick stuffed full and heavy. He maneuvered it onto the bed frame, straightened it, then went out again. He returned with wool blankets, thick and smelling of cedar. 3 trips total, and when he was done, the cabin looked less empty, more possible. "There's a lamp on the shelf," he said, pointing. "Kerosene's in the can under the sink. Use it sparingly. I'll bring more next week, but it's got to last. I'll be careful." Wood stacked outside, north side of the cabin. "Should be enough to get you through a few weeks if you don't waste it." "I won't." He looked around the room, checking for anything he'd missed. "I'll bring some provisions tomorrow. Flour, salt, coffee. Enough to get you started." "Mr. Carver," Margaret said. "You've already done more than I had any right to expect." "Maybe," he said. "But it's no hardship. I come to town for supplies anyway. Bringing a few more pounds of flour isn't going to break my back. Still, I'm grateful." He nodded, uncomfortable with thanks. "Well, I should get the wagon back to the barn while I can still see the road." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "You need anything tonight, you see smoke from my place, you can walk over. It's not far. Just follow the creek east." "I'll be fine," Margaret said. "I know you will," Daniel replied. "But the offer stands." He left. Margaret watched from the window as he climbed onto the wagon, turned the horses, and drove back up the track toward his own buildings. The wagon disappeared over the rise, and then she was alone. She stood there as the light faded, watching the valley turn from gold to blue to grey. The stove ticked and pinged as the metal expanded with heat. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like water. No other noise, no other movement. Margaret went to her trunk and opened it. The smell of her old life rose up, lavender sachets and wool, and the particular scent of the house she'd left behind. She pulled out her nightdress, her other dress, the skillet, the coffee pot, arranged them on the shelf and the table with the care of someone establishing territory. This is where the coffee lives, this is where the plates go. Small decisions that added up to occupation. She found the lamp, filled it from the kerosene can, lit it with a match from the tin on the shelf. Warm light filled the cabin, pushing the darkness back into the corners. She made coffee in the pot, strong and black, and sat at the table to drink it. The cabin creaked around her, settling into the cold night. She heard mice in the walls, the ordinary sound of creatures who'd thought the place abandoned. They'd learned different. Tomorrow she'd set traps. Tonight she'd let them be. She finished her coffee and washed the cup in water from the bucket Daniel had filled. No reason to waste kerosene, so she turned the lamp down until just a glow remained, then lay down on the bed fully dressed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The mattress smelled of straw and dust. The blankets were heavy and warm. Through the window she could see stars, more than she'd ever seen in Illinois, spread across the sky like someone had thrown diamonds on black velvet. She thought about Thomas Whitfield, the young rancher who'd turned her away on the platform, wondered if he'd found someone to give those flowers to, wondered if he'd spend years looking for the perfect woman, only to discover she didn't exist, wondered if he'd regret his choice, or if he'd forget her by the end of the week. It didn't matter. That was someone else's story now. This was hers. A cabin in Montana, a stove that worked, a stranger who'd offered help without strings. It wasn't what she'd planned. It wasn't what she'd imagined when she'd sold her furniture and bought the train ticket west. But she was warm. She was safe. She was in a place where she could breathe without someone watching to see if she did it right. That was more than she'd had yesterday. Margaret closed her eyes and let sleep come, listening to the wind and the creek and the vast silence of the valley. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Another answered. The world turned, indifferent and immense, and in a cabin by the cottonwoods, a woman who'd been rejected and rescued in the span of one day slept without dreaming. When she woke, it was still dark, but the quality of the darkness had changed. Dawn was coming, not here yet, but close. Margaret rose, added wood to the stove from the box beside it, set the coffee pot to heat. While it brewed, she stepped outside onto the porch. The cold hit her like a physical thing, sharp and clean. Frost coated everything, the grass, the trees, the wagon ruts in the track. Her breath came in clouds. To the east, the sky was beginning to pale, deep blue fading to grey, the stars dimming one by one. She heard hoofbeats before she saw him. Daniel Carver rode up on a grey horse, saddlebags behind him, his breath and the horse's breath mixing in the frozen air. He dismounted, tied the horse to the porch rail. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's almost ready," Margaret replied. "I won't stay long. Just wanted to bring these before I started work." He pulled a sack from the saddlebag, carried it inside, set it on the table. Flour, salt, coffee beans, a small bag of sugar, bacon wrapped in paper, cornmeal, dried beans. More than she'd expected, more than seemed reasonable for someone he'd met yesterday. "This is too much," Margaret said. "It's what I'd use in a month," Daniel said. "You'll probably stretch it further. I can't pay you back right now. Didn't ask you to." He looked at her direct. "Mrs. Donnelly, I'm not keeping accounts. You need these things. I have them. That's the end of it." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist on some kind of arrangement that kept the balance even. But she was practical enough to know when to accept help and proud enough to accept it with dignity. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "I'll check back in a few days. You need anything before then, you know where I am." "I do." He left as the sun broke the horizon, riding east toward his own place and whatever work waited for him there. Margaret stood on the porch and watched him go, then went back inside to her coffee and her stove and the simple fact of a day that belonged to her. She had survived worse than this. She would survive this too. And maybe, just maybe, she would do more than survive. Maybe she would live. The first 3 days passed in the rhythm of work. Margaret woke with the sun, built the fire, made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. She swept the cabin floor until no dust remained, scrubbed the table and shelves with water hauled from the well, set mousetraps baited with bacon grease. The mice learned quickly. By the third morning she'd caught 4 and found no new droppings. She washed her clothes in the creek, kneeling on the bank with a bar of lye soap, pounding the fabric against smooth stones, the way her mother had taught her 50 years ago. The water was cold enough to ache, but the work felt good, purposeful. She hung everything on a line strung between 2 cottonwoods and watched the wind dry them stiff. Daniel had come by once, the second afternoon, bringing eggs wrapped in cloth and a side of bacon still in the cure. He'd stayed long enough to check the stovepipe, noticed she'd already cleaned it, nodded approval, and left. 20 minutes total. No questions about how she was managing, no offers of help she hadn't asked for. Just the eggs and the bacon and the nod. She liked that about him. The valley revealed itself slowly. She learned where the sun hit first in the morning, the eastern slope above Daniel's buildings, where it lingered longest in the evening, the ridge to the west, turning the grass gold for half an hour before dark. She learned the sounds. Cattle calling to each other across distance, coyotes singing at dusk, the creek's voice changing as ice formed along its edges at night and melted again by noon. On the 4th day, she baked bread. The process took most of the morning, mixing flour and water and salt and the sourdough starter she'd carried from Illinois in a sealed jar, working the dough until her hands ached, letting it rise by the warm stove, punching it down, shaping the loaves, baking them in the oven that took up half the stove's body. When they came out, golden and cracked on top, the cabin smelled like every good kitchen she'd ever known. She wrapped 1 loaf in cloth, left the other to cool, and walked east along the creek. Daniel's place was bigger than she'd realized from a distance. The house was log and stone, built solid against weather, with real glass windows and a porch that wrapped 2 sides. The barn behind it stood tall and straight, red paint fading but the structure sound. Corrals stretched out from there, holding maybe 20 head of cattle that watched her pass with mild curiosity. She found him at the forge, a lean-to structure open on 3 sides, working a piece of iron in the coals. He wore a leather apron over his work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. Sweat darkened his collar. He looked up when her shadow crossed the light, pulled the iron from the fire and set it aside to cool. "Mrs. Donnelly." "Mr. Carver." She held out the wrapped loaf. "Payment on account." He wiped his hands on a rag, took the bread, unwrapped a corner, and examined it. "You didn't need to do this." "I know. I wanted to." He rewrapped it carefully. "Thank you. I haven't had proper bread since last fall when Mrs. Sorensen brought some by. She bakes well enough." But she uses too much salt for my taste. Margaret smiled. I'll remember that. He set the bread on the workbench, out of the way of sparks and soot. You settling in all right? I am. The cabin's sound. Haven't found any problems yet. If you do, let me know. I will. They stood there in the late morning light, the forge ticking as it cooled, smoke drifting up and away on the wind. Daniel picked up a hammer, turned it in his hands, set it back down. Storm's coming, he said, looking past her toward the western mountains. Tonight, maybe tomorrow. You've got enough wood? Margaret followed his gaze. The sky looked clear to her, pale blue with scattered clouds. How can you tell? The way the cattle are moving, heading to low ground. They know before we do. She looked at the cattle in the corral. They did seem restless, shifting and calling more than usual. I've got wood, she said, and enough food for a week if I need it. Good. These spring storms can be mean. Snow, wind, sometimes both. Could last a day, could last 3. I've been through Indiana winters. Montana's different, Daniel said. Cold here has teeth. Margaret nodded. I'll be ready. She walked back to the cabin, watching the sky as she went. By noon, the clouds had thickened, rolling in from the west in great grey masses that ate the blue. The wind picked up, no longer steady but gusting, pulling at her skirt and hair. The temperature dropped so fast she could feel it happening. She spent the afternoon preparing, brought in extra wood and stacked it by the stove, filled every container she had with water. From the well, 2 buckets, the coffee pot, the wash basin, her drinking cup. Checked the window latch, the door hinges, looked for gaps where wind could get through. Found one near the floorboard by the bed and stuffed it with rags. By evening, the first snow was falling. Not the gentle kind that drifted down lazy and soft, but hard pellets that struck the roof like thrown gravel, driven horizontal by wind that screamed around the cabin corners. Margaret lit the lamp early, fed the stove, made coffee, and ate cornbread with bacon. Outside, the world disappeared behind white curtains. She was washing her plate when she heard the horse. The sound came through the storm, muffled but distinct hoofbeats and a man's voice speaking low, trying to calm the animal. Margaret set down her plate and went to the window, but she couldn't see anything except snow and darkness. The knock came hard and urgent. Margaret had learned caution in 12 years of widowhood. She didn't open the door. Instead, she stood beside it and called out, "Who's there?" "Name's Fletcher." The voice was rough, strained. "My horse is about done. I need shelter." "Where are you coming from?" "Billings. Trying to make Sorensen Place, but I'm lost. Please, ma'am. I've been riding since noon." Margaret considered. The Sorensens were north, maybe 3 miles, easy to miss in this weather. The man's voice sounded genuine enough, cold, desperate, but not threatening. She unlatched the door and opened it 6 inches. The man outside was younger than his voice suggested, maybe 30, covered in snow from hat to boots. Ice crusted his mustache and eyebrows. His horse stood behind him, head down, flanks heaving. Both man and animal looked half frozen. "There's a lean-to around the back," Margaret said. "You can put your horse there, out of the wind, then come to the door." "Thank you, ma'am. God bless you." She closed the door and latched it again. Went to the stove and pulled the coffee pot forward to reheat. Checked the revolver she kept in the drawer under the table, still loaded, still where it should be. She didn't touch it, just noted its location, then pushed the drawer closed. Fletcher came back around and knocked again, softer this time. Margaret opened the door and let him in. He stumbled more than walked, legs stiff from riding. Snow fell from him in clumps as he moved, melting on the floorboards. He was tall and thin, with a weathered face and eyes that darted around the cabin, taking inventory: the stove, the table, the bed, the shelf, Margaret herself. "Sit down before you fall down," Margaret said, pointing to the chair farthest from the door. He sat heavily, pulled off his gloves with shaking hands. His fingers were white at the tips, bloodless. Margaret poured coffee into her spare cup and set it in front of him. "Drink slow," she said. "Too fast, and it'll come back up." He wrapped both hands around the cup and sipped. Colour began to return to his face. He looked at her over the rim, assessing. "You're alone out here?" "For the moment." "That's dangerous. Woman alone in a place like this." "I manage." He drank more coffee, eyes still moving, cataloguing. "You got food?" "I haven't eaten since morning." Margaret cut cornbread and bacon, set it on a plate, pushed it across the table. He ate like he'd been starving, barely chewing, washing it down with coffee. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm obliged." "You said you were heading to the Sorensens?" "That's right. Got business with Sorensen about some cattle. Thought I could make it before the storm hit, but the weather came up faster than expected." Margaret nodded. It was possible. It was also possible he was lying. She'd known enough liars to recognize the signs, too much detail where it wasn't needed, eyes that didn't quite hold steady, hands that moved restless even when the body sat still. "Storm like this could last till morning," she said. "You're welcome to sleep by the stove. I've got a blanket you can use." "That's kind of you." He finished the coffee, set the cup down. "You got a husband coming back? Someone checking on you?" "I expect so." "When?" "When the storm clears." It wasn't quite a lie. Daniel had said he'd check on her, just hadn't said when. Fletcher nodded slowly. His eyes went to the trunk against the wall, to the shelf with her few possessions, to the bed. "You got any whiskey? Warm a man up faster than coffee." "I don't drink spirits." "That's a shame." He stood, stretching, moving closer to the stove. "Mind if I dry out some? These clothes are soaked through." "Go ahead." He unbuttoned his coat, shook the snow from it, hung it on a hook by the door. Underneath he wore a wool shirt, also damp, and a gun belt with a Colt revolver holstered on his right hip. Margaret noticed, but didn't react. Lots of men went armed in Montana. It didn't necessarily mean trouble. Fletcher sat back down, this time in the chair closer to the door. He was between her and the exit now. Maybe a coincidence, maybe not. "You live here long?" he asked. "Long enough." "Where are you from originally?" "East." "That's a big place, East." Margaret didn't answer. She moved to the stove, added wood, adjusted the damper, kept her movements calm, unhurried. Behind her she felt Fletcher watching. "You're not very talkative," he said. "I talk when there's something worth saying." He laughed, a sound without much humor. "Fair enough." Outside, the wind howled louder, shaking the windows in their frames. Snow hissed against the glass. Fletcher glanced at the door, at the storm beyond it, then back at Margaret. "Hell of a night to be alone," he said. "I've seen worse." "Have you now?" He leaned back in the chair, one hand resting casual on his belt, near the gun. "What'd you say your name was?" "I didn't." His smile thinned. "You're a careful woman." "I've learned to be." They sat in silence for a while, the stove crackling, the storm raging. Margaret poured herself more coffee, sipped it slow, watching Fletcher over the rim of her cup. He was getting comfortable, too comfortable, settling in like he planned to stay a while. Around 9 o'clock she stood. "I'm going to bed. You can sleep by the stove. There's a blanket in the trunk if you need it." "That's generous." Fletcher didn't move. "You sure you trust me that much? Strange man in your cabin while you sleep?" "I don't trust anyone that much," Margaret said. "But you're half frozen, and the storm's not stopping. We'll both get through the night better if we don't pretend otherwise." She walked to the bed, lay down fully clothed on top of the blankets, and closed her eyes. She didn't sleep, just lay there, breathing, slow and even, listening. Fletcher moved around the cabin quietly. She heard him open the trunk, the hinges creaked, heard him moving things, looking through her possessions, heard the clink of dishes on the shelf. He was searching for something. Money, maybe. Valuables. Anything worth taking. He wouldn't find much. She'd sold everything worth selling before she left Illinois. After a while, he settled by the stove. She heard him arrange the blanket, heard the chair creak as he sat. Then nothing for a long time except the storm and the fire. Margaret waited. Hours passed. The lamp burned down and went out, leaving only firelight flickering through the stove grate. Outside, the wind began to ease, the worst of the storm moving east. Around midnight, Fletcher stood. Margaret heard him cross the floor, slow and careful. Heard him pause beside the table. The drawer slid open, the one where she kept the revolver. She opened her eyes. Fletcher stood silhouetted against the stove light, her gun in his hand, checking the cylinder. He looked toward the bed, saw her watching, and smiled. "Nothing personal," he said, "but a man's got to look after himself." Margaret sat up slowly. "That's my property. Was your property. Now it's mine." He gestured with the gun. "I'll be taking whatever else you've got worth carrying too. Food, money if you've got any. That's a nice coat hanging by the door. You came here for shelter. I came here because I saw smoke and figured whoever lived here might have things I could use. The storm was just good timing." Margaret's mind worked fast, calculating. He had the gun, she had nothing. The door was behind him. Even if she ran, she wouldn't make it far in the storm, not dressed the way she was. But she wasn't defenseless. "There's money in the trunk," she said. "Bottom, under the linens." Fletcher's eyes lit up. "Show me." Margaret stood and walked to the trunk, knelt beside it. Fletcher followed, standing over her with the gun pointed down. She opened the lid, moved aside the folded dresses and blankets, felt for the false bottom she'd built in years ago. Behind them, the door crashed open. Daniel Carver stood in the doorway, snow swirling around him, rifle leveled at Fletcher's back. "Drop it," Daniel said. His voice was flat, cold, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather. Fletcher spun, bringing the revolver around. Daniel fired. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. Fletcher went down hard, the revolver clattering from his hand. He clutched his shoulder, blood welling between his fingers, face twisted with pain and shock. Daniel stepped inside, kicked the revolver away, kept the rifle trained on Fletcher. "You all right, Mrs. Donnelly?" Margaret stood, legs shaking but voice steady. "I'm fine. I saw the extra horse in the lean-to. Came to check. I'm glad you did." Fletcher groaned, tried to sit up. Daniel put a boot on his chest and pushed him back down. "Stay there. You move again. The next one won't be your shoulder." "You shot me," Fletcher gasped. "You're lucky that's all I did." Daniel looked at Margaret. "You know this man? He knocked on my door during the storm, said he was lost, trying to reach the Sorensens. The Sorensens live north. He was going the wrong direction." Daniel pressed down harder with his boot. "You weren't lost, were you?" Fletcher didn't answer. Margaret picked up her revolver from where it had fallen, checked it, kept it pointed at the floor. "What do we do with him?" "Come morning, I'll take him to Billings. Let the sheriff sort it out." Daniel glanced at the wound. "He'll live. Unfortunately, I need a doctor," Fletcher said through gritted teeth. "You need a jail cell," Daniel replied, "but we'll get you both." They tied Fletcher to the chair with rope from Daniel's saddle, wrapped his shoulder tight to slow the bleeding. He cursed and threatened, and eventually went quiet, sagging against the bonds, like a puppet with cut strings. Daniel built up the fire while Margaret made coffee. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much to say. The thing had happened, been dealt with, and now they waited for morning. Around 2, Margaret sat at the table while Daniel stood by the window, rifle across his arms, watching the storm fade to scattered flurries. "You've done this before," Margaret said quietly. Daniel glanced at her. "Which part?" "Known when someone was lying, known when to act." He was silent for a moment. Then, "Had a partner once. We ran a freight business in Colorado, moving goods through the mountains. He seemed honest, worked hard, never gave me reason to doubt. One winter, we were snowed in at a way station, just the two of us, and $40,000 worth of silver we were hauling for a mining company. What happened? He waited until I was asleep, took my gun, told me he was taking the silver and the horses, Said he'd leave me enough supplies to survive until the thaw, that it was nothing personal, just business. Daniel's jaw tightened. I wasn't as asleep as he thought. You stopped him. I did. But I learned something that winter. Learned that desperation makes men do things they wouldn't otherwise. Learned to recognize the signs, the watching, the measuring, the way someone looks at your possessions like they're already planning what to take. He looked at Fletcher, slumped in the chair. This one had all the signs. Margaret nodded. My husband used to say that trust is earned slow but lost fast. Your husband was right. They sat in silence as the night deepened toward dawn. Fletcher slept or pretended to sleep, head lolled forward. The storm blew itself out, leaving the world buried in fresh snow that glowed pale in the darkness. When the sky began to lighten, Daniel untied Fletcher, hauled him up, and walked him outside at gunpoint. Margaret heard them moving around the lean-to, heard Daniel's horse snort and stamp. Then hoofbeats, fading east toward Daniel's place. She stood alone in the cabin, looking at the blood on the floor where Fletcher had fallen. She got a bucket and a rag and scrubbed it clean, working until no trace remained. Then she made breakfast, eggs and bacon and fresh coffee, and sat down to eat. The door opened. Daniel came in, snow on his shoulders, face tired. He's secured in my barn, he said. I'll take him to town this afternoon. Sit down. Eat something. He didn't argue. Just hung his coat and sat across from her, accepting the plate she offered. They ate without talking, the silence comfortable, the kind shared between people who'd been through something together and didn't need to analyze it to death. When they finished, Daniel pushed his plate back and looked at her across the table. You handled yourself well last night, he said. So did you. I meant before I got there. You kept him talking, kept him calm. That's harder than it looks. I've had practice, Margaret said. Living as long as I have, you learn to read people, learn when to stand firm and when to bend. Most people panic. Panic gets you killed. Daniel smiled slightly. You're not most people, Mrs. Donnelly. Neither are you, Mr. Carver. They sat there as the morning light grew stronger, filling the cabin with pale gold. Outside, the valley lay clean and white, the storm's work complete. Two people who'd been strangers 5 days ago shared coffee and the quiet understanding that comes from surviving the night together. Margaret rose and poured more coffee. Daniel accepted it with a nod. Thank you, she said, for coming when you did. I wasn't going to leave you alone in a storm with a stranger in your cabin. How did you know? I didn't, but I've learned to trust my instincts. He sipped the coffee. When I saw that extra horse, something didn't sit right. Good instincts. Expensive ones. But it's worth it. They finished the coffee as the sun broke clear of the eastern hills. Daniel stood, pulled on his coat. I'll be back before dark, he said, after I've dealt with our friend in the barn. Be careful. Always am. He left. Margaret stood on the porch and watched him ride away, his figure dark against the white landscape. Then she went back inside, stoked the fire, and began the ordinary work of the day. The cabin was hers again, safe again, and she was still standing. That was enough. The week after Fletcher went to jail, the valley settled into a different kind of quiet. The snow melted fast under bright sun, turning the ground to mud that sucked at boots and made the creek run high and loud. Margaret spent her days working the small plot behind the cabin, turning earth that had been fallow since the last hand moved on, breaking clods with a hoe Daniel had brought by without being asked. He'd returned from Billings 2 days after taking Fletcher in, riding up to her cabin in the late afternoon with a sack of seed potatoes tied to his saddle. Sheriff's holding him for trial, Daniel had said, dismounting. Turns out Fletcher's his real name, but he's wanted in Wyoming for theft and assault. They're sending someone to collect him. Margaret had been mending a shirt on the porch, needle and thread working through worn fabric. She'd set it aside and stood. He say anything? Claimed he was just looking for shelter, that I shot an innocent man. Daniel's mouth had quirked slightly. Sheriff didn't believe him. Hard to explain why an innocent man was holding someone else's gun. I'm grateful you were there. Daniel had untied the potato sack. These need planting soon. Ground's thawed enough now. Thought you might want them. She'd taken the sack, felt the weight of possibility in it. You keep bringing me things. You keep making bread. He'd nodded toward the porch where a fresh loaf sat wrapped in cloth. Seems like a fair trade. That had been 3 days ago. Now Margaret worked the garden plot, setting potatoes in rows, covering them with earth and old straw. Her back ached from bending, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from building something instead of just surviving. She heard the wagon before she saw it, wheels creaking over the muddy track. Daniel drove up with 2 lengths of lumber in the bed, and what looked like chicken wire rolled up beside them. "Morning," he called, setting the brake. Margaret straightened, pressing one hand to her lower back. "You're up early. Wanted to get this done before the day gets away from me." He climbed down, pulled out the lumber. "Thought you could use a chicken coop." She stared at him. "A chicken coop? You've got the garden started. Chickens would give you eggs, meat eventually, make you more self-sufficient." He carried the lumber to a flat spot near the cabin's north side. "If you want them, that is." "I'm not assuming." Margaret followed him, watched as he laid out the wood, measuring distances with his eye. "Where would I get chickens?" "Sorensons have extras." Mrs. Sorensen mentioned it last time I saw her in town, said they'd hatched more than they needed this spring. "I'd have to pay for them. They'd probably trade for bread and butter if you've got it." "Mrs. Sorensen's not unreasonable," Margaret considered. Chickens meant responsibility, meant committing to this place for longer than just getting through the next week. Meant planning for a future instead of just enduring a present. "All right," she said. "If you're offering to build it, I won't say no." Daniel smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. "Good. Hand me that saw." They worked together through the morning. Daniel cut and fitted the lumber, while Margaret held boards steady, passed him nails, learned the rhythm of building something from nothing. He worked with the quiet competence of someone who'd built many things, measuring twice, cutting once, never wasting material or motion. By noon, the frame stood complete. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool air. "We'll let that set. Finish the rest tomorrow. Gives the joints time to settle." Margaret had made stew the night before, thick with vegetables and the last of the bacon. She brought it out in bowls, with cornbread still warm from the morning baking. They sat on the porch steps and ate, watching the creek run full with snowmelt. "You're good at this," Margaret said between bites. "Building, making things that last." Daniel shrugged. "My father taught me. He always said if you're going to do a thing, do it right the first time. Saves you from doing it twice." Smart man. He was. Daniel's voice carried something else now, something that sat behind the words. "Died when I was 19. Pneumonia took him in 3 days. One morning he was fine. By the end of the week, he was gone." Margaret knew that particular pain, the speed at which the world could change. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." But the way he said it suggested time hadn't healed as much as people claimed it should. After that, "I couldn't stay in Colorado. Too many memories in every fence post and barn board. That's why I came north. To start over. To start different," Daniel corrected. "Can't really start over. The past follows whether you want it to or not. But you can build new things on top of it." "Yeah." He looked at the chicken coop frame, at the garden plot with its neat rows. "You can do that." They finished eating. Daniel stood, stretched, looked at the sun. "I should get back. Got fence repairs that won't do themselves." "Tomorrow, then? For the rest of the coop?" "Tomorrow." He drove away, wagon rattling over the muddy track. Margaret washed the bowls and watched the afternoon light move across the valley. Something had shifted between them. Some invisible line crossed from strangers, helping each other to something that didn't have a name yet, but felt solid anyway. The next morning arrived cold and bright. Margaret was hauling water when Daniel rode up on horseback this time, tools in a saddlebag. "No wagon today?" she asked. "Don't need it. Everything else I need is already here." They finished the coupe by early afternoon, wire stretched tight, door hung on leather hinges, roosting bars fitted inside. Daniel stood back and examined it critically, checking for gaps or weaknesses. "That'll hold," he said finally. "Coyotes won't get through that wire. When can I get the chickens?" "I'll take you to the Sorensens tomorrow if the weather holds." Fair warning, though Mrs. Sorensen talks enough for 3 people. You'll hear about every ailment her husband's had since they married, and her opinion on everyone within 20 miles. Margaret smiled. "I've known women like that. They're usually kind underneath all the words." "She is that," Daniel agreed. "Just be prepared to spend some time there." That evening, after Daniel had gone home, Margaret sat on her porch and watched the light fade. The chicken coop stood ready and waiting. The garden was planted. The cabin no longer felt temporary. It felt like hers, like something she'd built instead of something she'd borrowed. The next day they rode together to the Sorensen place, Margaret sitting behind Daniel on his horse, holding to his waist for balance. The closeness should have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. They'd worked too many hours side by side for formality to mean much anymore. The Sorensen house sat low and square against the wind, painted white once but weathered to grey. Chickens scratched in the yard. A milk cow watched them approach with bovine disinterest. Mrs. Sorensen came out before they dismounted, wiping her hands on her apron, face lighting up at the sight of visitors. She was a round woman with apple cheeks and silver blonde hair, braided and pinned. "Mr. Carver. And who is this you bring to see us?" "This is Mrs. Margaret Donnelly," Daniel said, helping Margaret down. "She's living in my old hand's cabin. Looking to start a flock if you've got birds to spare." "Mrs. Donnelly. Come in, come in. Of course we have chickens. We have too many chickens. They lay more eggs than we can eat, and Ole won't let me make more than 2 chickens into soup a month. Says I'll leave us with none. But I tell him chickens multiply faster than we can eat them." She ushered them inside while still talking, barely pausing for breath. The house smelled of bread and coffee and the particular warmth of a place where people had lived simply and well for a long time. Mr. Sorensen sat at the table, a silent man with a weathered face who nodded greeting and went back to mending a harness. Mrs. Sorensen sat them down, poured coffee, brought out cardamom bread that was still warm, and talked steadily for the next half hour about weather and crops and her cousin in Minnesota and the new family that had moved in 5 miles west and how young they were. Barely 20, the both of them, and did they know what they were getting into? Probably not, but that's youth for you. Margaret listened, made appropriate sounds of agreement, and understood that this was simply how Mrs. Sorensen communicated a steady stream of observations and opinions and stories that required no response beyond presence. Eventually the topic came around to chickens. "I have 6 pullets ready to go," Mrs. Sorensen said. "Young layers, just started producing. You'll get eggs from them through the fall if you feed them right. I'll throw in a rooster too if you want to breed them, though roosters are noisy things and Ole says they're mean, but I tell him it's just their nature." 6 hens would be perfect, Margaret said. "What would you want for them?" Mrs. Sorensen waved a hand. "Oh, I don't need money." "You bake, Mr. Carver tells me." "I do. Then you bring me bread when you come to town, or butter if you get a cow someday. We'll call it even." It was more generosity than the chickens were worth, but Margaret recognized it for what it was, a welcome, an acceptance into the community of women who kept things running while their men worked the land. "That's very kind," Margaret said. "I'll make sure you get good bread." "I'm sure you will. You have the hands for it, I can tell. Now, let me show you which birds I've picked out." They went outside. Mrs. Sorensen's chickens were healthy and well kept, roosting in a coop twice the size of the one Daniel had built. She caught the 6 pullets with practiced ease, put them in a crate, and added a sack of feed to tide Margaret over. "Now you come back any time, Mrs." Sorensen said, gripping Margaret's hands. "It's good to have another woman nearby. We're scattered so far out here. We need to keep together when we can." "I will," Margaret promised. "Thank you." They rode back with the crate tied carefully behind the saddle, the chickens making soft, concerned noises. When they reached the cabin, Daniel helped Margaret transfer them to their new home. The birds explored their space cautiously, pecking at the ground, testing the water Margaret had set out. "They'll settle in fast," Daniel said. "Give them a few days and they'll be laying." "I know. I kept chickens before, back in Illinois. Why didn't you say?" "You seem to enjoy teaching me," Margaret said, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Daniel laughed, a real laugh that surprised them both. "You let me explain things you already knew?" "Only some of them, and you explained them well." He shook his head, still smiling. "You're a strange woman, Mrs. Donnelly." "I've been called worse, Mr. Carver." They stood, watching the chickens adjust to their new home, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. After a while, Daniel said, "There's a social at the church next Saturday. Spring gathering, potluck supper, whole community comes." Margaret looked at him. "You're inviting me?" "I'm mentioning it," Daniel said carefully. "You'd be welcome if you wanted to come. Meet some more of the neighbors besides the Sorensens. Let people know you're here." "Let people know I'm the old woman living alone in your old hand's cabin, you mean?" "Let people know you're part of the valley now," Daniel corrected. "Whether you came here the usual way or not doesn't matter much to most folks. They're more interested in whether you pull your weight and whether you're decent to be around." Margaret considered. Part of her wanted to say no, to avoid the stares and questions and judgment that would inevitably come. But another part, the part that had dragged a trunk 3 blocks through Billings, that had faced down Fletcher with nothing but nerve, that had planted potatoes and built a chicken coop, that part wanted to stand in a room full of people and show them she wasn't hiding. "I'll think about it," she said. "Fair enough." Daniel untied his horse. "I'll be by on Friday either way. Need to check that fence line on the south border, and I could use an extra set of hands if you're willing." "I'm willing." He mounted up, settling into the saddle with easy grace. "You did good today, Mrs. Donnelly. So did you, Mr. Carver." He rode away as the sun dropped toward the mountains. Margaret watched him go, then turned to her chickens, her garden, her cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. She'd been in Montana less than 2 weeks, and already this place had shaped itself around her in ways Illinois never had. That night, she made a decision. Saturday, she would go to the social. She would walk into that church with her head up and her best dress on, and she would let the valley see her for what she was. Not a mail-order bride who got rejected, not a charity case, not someone's burden. Just Margaret Donnelly, 68 years old and still standing. Friday arrived with perfect weather, cool but clear. Margaret walked to the south fence line where Daniel was already working, pulling old wire and replacing rotted posts. She fell into the rhythm of it easily, holding posts steady while he tamped earth around them, stretching wire tight while he stapled it in place. They worked for hours, stopping only for water and the sandwiches Margaret had packed. By late afternoon, the fence stood straight and sound, stretching across the hillside like a declaration. Daniel walked the length of it one more time, testing each post. "That'll hold for years," he said with satisfaction. "Good work, then. Good help." He looked at her, squinting slightly against the lowering sun. "You decided about tomorrow?" "I'm coming," Margaret said, "if the invitation still stands." "It does." "What time?" "I'll come by around 4. Social starts at 5, but it's good to arrive early. Help set up, make a better impression." Margaret nodded. "I'll be ready." Saturday, she spent the morning baking, 2 loaves of bread, a rhubarb pie from the wild rhubarb she'd found growing by the creek, and sugar cookies cut into simple rounds. She washed and pressed her good dress, dark green wool with black trim, and pinned her hair up properly for the first time since arriving in Montana. When she looked at herself in the small mirror she'd hung by the window, she saw a woman who'd aged but hadn't broken. The lines around her eyes and mouth had been earned. The silver in her hair had been paid for. She looked like someone who'd lived, and lived honestly, and she found she didn't mind that at all. Daniel arrived exactly at 4, driving the wagon instead of riding. He'd cleaned up too fresh, shirt, hair combed, boots brushed free of mud. He looked at her, standing on the porch with her basket of food, and something crossed his face, something quick and unguarded before he got it under control. "You look nice, Mrs. Donnelly." "So do you, Mr. Carver." He helped her up onto the wagon seat, set her basket carefully in the back. They drove toward town as the afternoon opened up around them, full of light and possibility. "Fair warning," Daniel said after a mile. "People will talk. They'll make assumptions. Let them. You might hear things you don't like." "I've heard worse." Margaret smoothed her skirt. "I came here to start different, remember? Can't do that by hiding." Daniel glanced at her, then back at the road. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose you can't." The church stood at the edge of Billings, white clapboard with a bell tower that caught the late sun. Wagons and horses filled the yard. People moved between the church and the hall beside it, carrying dishes and children and conversation. Daniel set the brake and climbed down, then offered Margaret his hand. She took it, stepped down, and together they walked toward the door. The talking stopped when they entered. Not completely, not dramatically, but enough to notice. Heads turned, eyes tracked them across the room. Margaret felt the weight of attention, the curiosity and judgment and speculation that came with being new and different and unexpected. She kept walking. Mrs. Sorensen appeared like a blessing, bustling over with her arms out. "Mrs. Donnelly, Mr. Carver, come in, set your things on the table. We're so glad you came." She swept Margaret into the women's orbit, introducing her to Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry, to Mrs. Patterson, whose husband worked at the bank, to the widow Mrs. Flynn, who kept the boarding house Margaret had never stayed in. The women ranged from cautiously welcoming to genuinely warm, asking polite questions about where she was from and how she was settling, and wasn't it nice to have good neighbors. One woman, younger and sharper around the edges, looked Margaret up and down with barely concealed disapproval. "You're living in Mr. Carver's cabin?" "I am." "That's unusual." "It's practical," Margaret said evenly. "The cabin was empty. I needed a place. Mr. Carver was kind enough to offer it. People might get the wrong idea." "People can think what they like," Margaret replied. "I can't control that, only how I conduct myself." The woman opened her mouth to say more, but Mrs. Sorensen cut in smoothly, steering the conversation towards safer topics like weather and gardens and the new schoolteacher who was starting in the fall. Across the room, Margaret caught Daniel's eye. He stood with a group of men, listening to some story, but his attention was on her. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod. "You're doing fine." She nodded back. "I know." The evening unfolded in the way of small-town gatherings, food and talk and music from someone's fiddle. Children ran between the adults' legs. Old men told stories they'd told 100 times before. Women compared recipes and complained about their husbands in the fond way of people who wouldn't trade them for anything. Margaret found herself relaxing, letting the rhythm of community wash over her. She wasn't invisible here, but she wasn't examined under a microscope either. Just another person, eating pie and listening to gossip and existing in the same space as others without apology. As the sun set and lamps were lit, Daniel appeared at her side. "Ready to go?" he asked quietly. "Soon," Margaret said. "Let me help clean up first." They worked alongside the other women, washing dishes and putting away tables and sweeping floors. It was ordinary work, the kind that built connection without requiring words. By the time they left, Margaret had been invited to Mrs. Chen's for tea, had promised Mrs. Sorensen more bread, and had been accepted not universally, but enough into the fabric of the valley. On the drive home, they rode in comfortable silence. The stars came out thick and bright overhead. Somewhere a coyote sang, and another answered. "Thank you," Margaret said finally. "For what?" "For giving me a reason to show up." Daniel looked at her in the starlight. "You didn't need a reason, Mrs. Donnelly. You just needed to decide." "Maybe, but it helped having someone ask." They reached her cabin. Daniel helped her down, carried her empty basket to the porch. He stood there for a moment, hat in his hands, looking like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. "Mrs. Donnelly." "Margaret," she said. "After everything, I think you can call me Margaret." "Margaret." He tried it out, nodded. "Then you should call me Daniel." "All right, Daniel." He put his hat back on. "This has been... I'm glad you're here. In the valley, I mean. It's good having someone to..." He trailed off, but Margaret understood what he wasn't saying. It was good having someone to work beside, to share coffee with, to build things alongside. It was good not being alone in all the ways that mattered. "I'm glad too," she said simply. Daniel climbed back onto the wagon. "I'll see you Monday. If you need anything before then, I know where you are." He drove away into the darkness. Margaret went inside to her cabin, her chickens, her planted garden, and sat at the table in the lamplight. She'd come to Montana expecting one kind of life and had found something entirely different. Not romance, exactly, not rescue, just partnership, forming slowly out of shared work and honest conversation, and the simple act of showing up when it mattered. It was enough. More than enough. It was exactly what she needed. Spring deepened into early summer, bringing green to the valley that hadn't existed before. The grass grew tall enough to hide ground squirrels. Wildflowers bloomed in scattered patches, Indian paintbrush and lupine, and something yellow Margaret didn't have a name for. Her garden pushed up through the soil in neat rows, potato plants spreading their leaves, bean vines beginning to climb the poles Daniel had set for them. The chickens settled into reliable production, giving her 6 eggs most days, sometimes 7. She traded eggs and bread in town now, building a network of small exchanges, flour from the mercantile, sugar from Mrs. Patterson, whose brother shipped it from Denver, fabric scraps from Mrs. Chen for patching. She was becoming part of the valley's economy, no longer an outsider depending on charity, but a participant in the quiet trade that kept isolated communities functioning. Daniel came by most mornings now, usually with some excuse, a tool he thought she might need, fence wire left over from his own repairs, news from town. They'd fallen into an easy pattern of working together without formal arrangement. He'd help her split wood or repair a weak spot in the chicken coop, and she'd send him home with bread or eggs or once a shirt she'd mended when she noticed the elbow was coming apart. Neither of them spoke about what they were building. It existed in the spaces between words, in the comfortable silences, and the way they moved around each other without collision, anticipating needs before they were voiced. One morning in early June, Daniel rode up with a piece of paper in his hand. "There's a dance next Saturday," he said, dismounting, "in town, celebrating the spring roundup finishing. Whole valley turns out for it." Margaret was weeding the garden, skirt tucked up to keep it clean. She sat back on her heels. "A dance, music, food, the usual." He handed her the paper, a printed notice from the church auxiliary. "Starts at 7. Goes till midnight or when people get tired, whichever comes first." She read the notice. Neat letters advertising the spring roundup dance and community celebration, all welcome. "You planning to go?" "I am." Daniel shifted his weight. "Thought you might want to come along." Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "As your guest." "As my guest," he confirmed, "if you're willing." She studied his face, trying to read what he wasn't saying. The social had been one thing, a community gathering where people expected to see neighbors. The dance was different. A dance meant something. especially if you arrived with someone. People will talk, she said. They already talk. Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact. Mrs. Patterson mentioned to me last week that she thought it was interesting how often my wagon was seen at your cabin. Mr. Flynn asked if I was planning to marry you or just scandalize the valley. Margaret felt heat rise to her face. What did you tell him? That my business was my own, and he should worry less about other people's lives and more about fixing that lien on his barn before it falls over. Despite herself, Margaret smiled. I imagine he appreciated that. He turned red and walked away. So I'd say the message was received. Daniel looked at her seriously. But he's not wrong that people are noticing. We can ignore it, or we can face it head on. Show them that what we're doing isn't something to be ashamed of. And what are we doing, Daniel? He was quiet for a moment, choosing words with care. Building something. What it turns into, I don't know yet. But I know I'd rather have you at that dance than anyone else in the valley. And I know I'm tired of pretending I don't look forward to seeing you every day. The honesty of it struck her silent. Margaret had spent 12 years as a widow, learning to be alone, learning that companionship was a luxury she couldn't afford to want. But here was this man, steady and real, offering not promises but presence. All right, she said. I'll go. Daniel's shoulders relaxed slightly, tension she hadn't noticed releasing. Good. I'll come by around 6:30. Give us time to get there before it starts. The week passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret washed and pressed her best dress, the same green wool she'd worn to the social, and realized it was too heavy for summer dancing. She rode into town with Mrs. Sorensen, who'd stopped by with eggs to trade, and used some of her egg money to buy fabric at the mercantile. 3 yards of light blue cotton, simple but pretty. She spent 2 days cutting and sewing, working by lamplight after her other chores were done. The dress came together slowly, high-necked and long-sleeved, because that's what propriety demanded, but fitted through the bodice and falling in clean lines that didn't hide her shape. She wasn't young, but she wasn't dead either, and the dress reflected that. Mrs. Sorensen stopped by on Friday, ostensibly to return a bread pan, but really to see how Margaret was doing. I heard you're going to the dance with Mr. Carver, she said, settling at the table with coffee. Word travels fast. In a valley this small, word doesn't need to travel, it just exists. Mrs. Sorensen's eyes sparkled. I think it's wonderful. Daniel Carver is a good man, better than most. And you've proven yourself, haven't you? Working hard, keeping your place nice, contributing to the community. Some people don't see it that way. Some people see sin in a sunrise, Mrs. Sorensen said dismissively. You can't live your life worried about the Mrs. Harrises of the world. Mrs. Harris? Clara Harris. Young thing, married to the telegraph operator, thinks she knows everything about how people should behave. She's been telling anyone who'll listen that it's inappropriate for a woman your age to be keeping company with a man. Mrs. Sorensen snorted. As if there's an age limit on companionship. I told her she should mind her own marriage and let others mind theirs. Margaret sipped her coffee. I appreciate you defending me. I'm not defending you, dear. I'm stating facts. You and Daniel have done nothing wrong, and even if you had, it wouldn't be my business or Clara Harris's business or anyone else's. She leaned forward conspiratorially. Between you and me, I think she's jealous. Her husband's about as interesting as fence wire, and she married him because her father approved. Probably can't stand seeing 2 people actually choosing each other. Saturday arrived warm and clear. Margaret bathed in the creek, washing her hair with soap Mrs. Chen had given her, scented faintly with lavender. She dried it in the sun, combed it smooth, and pinned it up in a style that was practical but softer than her usual severe bun. The blue dress fit well. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw not the rejected mail-order bride from 2 months ago, but a woman who'd built a life with her own hands. The lines around her eyes remained. The silver in her hair caught the light. She looked her age, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Daniel arrived exactly on time, driving the wagon with the bed swept clean and blankets laid across the seat for comfort. He dressed carefully, too, pressed shirt, string tie, coat that looked new or at least rarely worn. His hair was still damp from washing. He stared at her for a long moment when she stepped onto the porch. "You look beautiful, Margaret." The words landed simply, honestly. Margaret felt something warm expand in her chest. "Thank you. You clean up well yourself." He helped her onto the wagon, and they drove toward town as the evening light turned everything gold. Other wagons traveled the same direction, families and couples heading to the dance. People waved or nodded as they passed. Some stared. Margaret kept her back straight and her eyes forward. The dance was held in the largest barn in town, belonging to a rancher named Hutchins, who hosted it every year. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over the swept floor. Tables lined one wall, already laden with food brought by various families. At the far end, 4 musicians tuned their instruments, 2 fiddles, a guitar, and someone's daughter, on a small pump organ. People filled the space, dressed in their best, talking and laughing with the particular energy that comes from hard-working people taking a rare evening off. Children ran between adults' legs, excited by the late hour and the music. Old-timers sat along the walls, saving their energy for later when the dancing got serious. Daniel helped Margaret down from the wagon. She carried the rhubarb pie she'd made, and he carried a basket with bread and the smoked ham he'd prepared. They walked to the barn together, and once again, conversation dimmed as they entered. Mrs. Sorensen appeared immediately, loud and welcoming, kissing Margaret's cheek and complimenting her dress. Mr. Sorensen nodded silently to Daniel, which seemed to be his version of enthusiastic approval. Others came over: Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Chen, some of the men Daniel knew from working cattle. But Margaret felt the other attention too. The women who didn't approach, who stood in clusters and whispered behind their hands. The men who looked at Daniel with expressions ranging from amusement to disapproval. She saw Clara Harris standing near the punch bowl, spine rigid with judgment, speaking to 2 other young women who kept glancing Margaret's way. The music started, and the first dance was announced, a reel that required couples to line up facing each other. Daniel turned to Margaret. "Will you dance with me?" She looked at the forming lines, at the people watching, at Clara Harris's pursed mouth. Everything in her old life whispered caution. Don't make a spectacle, don't invite criticism, don't reach for things that aren't meant for women your age. But she'd left her old life behind when she stepped off that train in Billings. "Yes," Margaret said. They joined the line, Daniel across from her, his hand extended. The fiddles struck up bright and fast, and the dance began. Margaret knew this reel had danced it at barn dances in Illinois 20 years ago, when her husband was still alive, and the world felt smaller and more certain. Her feet remembered the steps, even if her breath came shorter than it used to. Daniel moved with surprising grace for such a tall man, never missing a beat, his hand warm when it caught hers during the turns. Around them, other couples moved through the patterns. Some smiled at them in genuine pleasure. Others danced with stiff backs and disapproving eyes. Margaret didn't care. She was dancing, really dancing, for the first time in over a decade, and the joy of it pushed everything else aside. The reel ended. People clapped. The musicians struck up a waltz. Daniel didn't let her leave the floor. He simply pulled her into position, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, and began to move. The waltz was slower, more intimate, requiring them to stay close and move together. Margaret could feel the warmth of his hand through the fabric of her dress, could smell the soap he'd washed with and the faint scent of wood smoke that seemed permanently part of him. "You're a good dancer," she said quietly. "My mother insisted on lessons, said even a rancher should know how to move properly." He smiled slightly. "I thought it was useless at the time. I'm grateful now." They turned slowly around the floor. Margaret became aware of how closely they fit together, how naturally their steps matched. She caught sight of Clara Harris watching them, face pinched with disapproval, and something defiant rose in Margaret's chest. Let them look. Let them judge. She was 68 years old, and she was dancing with a man who saw her as she was and wanted her company anyway. That was more than most people found in a lifetime. The waltz ended. Daniel led her from the floor to where cups of punch waited. He poured two, handed her one. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine. Some people are staring. Let them stare." Margaret sipped the punch, too sweet but cold and welcome. "I didn't come here to make them comfortable." Daniel's smile reached his eyes. "No, I suppose you didn't." Clara Harris chose that moment to approach, two other young women flanking her like deputies. She stopped in front of Margaret with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Donnelly. Such a spirited display." "Mrs. Harris." Margaret kept her voice even. "I suppose at your age one must seize opportunities when they present themselves." Clara's tone dripped false sympathy. "Before it's too late." The women beside her tittered. Margaret felt Daniel tense beside her, but she put a hand on his arm. "Let me handle this." "You're right," Margaret said calmly. "At my age, I've learned not to waste time on things that don't matter. Like worrying what strangers think of my choices." Clara's smile tightened. "I'm simply concerned for propriety. A woman living alone in a man's cabin, spending so much time in his company, people talk, Mrs. Donnelly. Then people need better hobbies." Margaret replied, "I live in an empty cabin that would otherwise go to rot. Mr. Carver has been nothing but generous and proper. If you see scandal in kindness and community, that says more about you than it does about us." One of Clara's companions whispered something. Clara's face flushed. "I'm only thinking of your reputation." "My reputation is my own to manage," Margaret cut in, still calm but with steel underneath. "And I'm perfectly capable of managing it. But I appreciate your concern. I'm sure it comes from the very best intentions." The last part carried just enough edge that Clara's flush deepened. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned sharply and walked away, her companions hurrying after her. Mrs. Sorensen appeared at Margaret's elbow, eyes dancing with suppressed laughter. "Well done. Clara Harris has needed someone to stand up to her for years." "I didn't come here to make enemies," Margaret said. "You didn't make an enemy. You just declined to be bullied, which is different." Mrs. Sorensen patted her arm. "Now come, let me introduce you to Mrs. Hutchins. She's been wanting to meet you." The evening continued. Margaret danced with Daniel 3 more times, and once with Mr. Sorensen, who proved surprisingly light on his feet despite his general silence. She talked with the women who approached her genuinely, deflected the ones who came out of nosiness, and ate pie while watching the children play. As the night deepened, the music slowed and the crowd thinned. Families with small children left first, then the older couples. By 10 o'clock, only the diehards remained, the young people still courting, the old-timers telling stories, the musicians playing for the love of it. Daniel found Margaret sitting on a bench, watching the dancers. He held out his hand. "One more?" She took it. This dance was different, slower, quieter, the kind couples did when the performance was over, and all that remained was connection. They moved together in the lamplight, shadows shifting around them, and Margaret felt something settle in her chest that she'd thought lost forever. Not youth, not the desperate romance of first love, but something richer and more durable, the recognition of a true companion, someone who saw all her rough edges and worn places and chose to stay anyway. "Margaret," Daniel said quietly, his voice close to her ear, "I want you to know what we're building. Whatever it becomes, it's real to me. I'm not playing at this." "I know," she replied. "It's real to me, too. People like Clara Harris will keep talking. Let them. It might get harder before it gets easier. I've survived harder things than gossip." Daniel pulled back slightly to look at her face. "Yes," he said, "you have." The song ended. The musicians announced the last dance. Daniel and Margaret stayed on the floor, joined now by only 3 other couples, and danced until the final notes faded into silence. They drove home under stars so thick they seemed to press down from above. The night air was cool and clean. Margaret sat close to Daniel on the wagon seat, not quite touching but near enough to feel his warmth. "Thank you," she said as they approached her cabin. "For what?" "For asking me to dance. For standing beside me when Clara Harris tried to make me feel small. For not caring what they think." "I care what they think," Daniel corrected. "I just care more about what I know to be true." He helped her down, walked her to her porch. The cabin waited dark and quiet, her chickens settled in their coop, the garden growing silently in the moonlight. Daniel stood, with his hat in his hands, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm not a young man anymore, Margaret. I'm 31, but I've lived enough to know what matters and what doesn't. And what matters to me is building something real with someone I respect, someone I trust, someone who makes me want to be better than I am." Margaret's throat tightened. "Daniel, I'm not asking for an answer tonight," he said quickly. "I'm just telling you where I stand, so you know, so there's no confusion about what I'm offering." "What are you offering?" "Partnership," he said simply. "In whatever form you're willing to accept. If that's just working together and sharing coffee, that's enough. If it's more someday marriage, a shared life, I'd welcome that. But I won't push. You've had enough people pushing you to last a lifetime." Margaret looked at this man who'd offered her shelter when she had nowhere to go, who'd built her a chicken coop and taught her the valley, and stood beside her while gossips whispered, who saw her not as a burden or a scandal or someone to be pitied, but as an equal. "I'm not ready to answer tonight either," she said honestly. "But I want you to know these past months, building this life here, working beside you, it's been the freest I've felt in years, maybe ever. And whatever we call this thing between us, it matters to me too." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's enough, for now." He put his hat back on, touched the brim in that gesture that had become familiar. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night, Daniel." She watched him drive away, his wagon disappearing into the darkness. Then she went inside to her cabin, lit the lamp, and sat at the table in the quiet. Outside, the valley slept. Inside, a woman who'd been rejected and rescued and reborn sat thinking about the future for the first time in 12 years. And for the first time in 12 years, that future looked like something worth reaching for. Summer settled over the valley like a warm hand, bringing long days and short nights and work that stretched from dawn until the light failed. Margaret's garden flourished in the heat, tomatoes ripening on the vine, beans heavy enough to pull the plants sideways, squash spreading across the ground in defiant abundance. She harvested and preserved, filling jars with vegetables she'd grown herself, lining them up on the shelf like proof of permanence. The chickens molted and grew fat. Margaret traded their eggs for coffee and sugar, and once, extravagantly, for a length of calico fabric she had no immediate use for, but couldn't resist. She was learning the rhythms of this place, when the creek ran highest, when the afternoon storms rolled in from the west, when the cattle moved down from the high pastures seeking shade. She was also learning the rhythms of Daniel Carver. He came by most mornings. Earlier now, that summer work demanded long hours. Often he'd already been working for 2 hours before he appeared at her door, hay chaff in his hair, dirt under his nails, asking if she needed help with anything heavy before he headed to the far pastures. Margaret always had coffee ready, strong and black the way he liked it, and they'd drink it standing on the porch, watching the sun climb higher. They didn't talk about the dance, didn't talk about what he'd said that night or what it meant or where they were headed. Instead, they talked about ordinary things, weather, cattle, the new family that had moved in 3 valleys over, whether Margaret's tomatoes would beat Mrs. Sorensen's to harvest. It was comfortable, safe, and Margaret recognized it for what it was, both of them circling something important, neither quite ready to name it. Then came the day in mid-July when everything changed. Margaret woke to find one of her chickens dead in the coop, killed by something that had dug under the wire during the night. A fox, probably, or a weasel. The other hens, clustered in the corner, agitated and refusing to settle. Margaret buried the dead bird and examined the coop, finding where the predator had tunneled beneath the frame. She tried to fix it herself, digging deeper and placing stones to block the gap, but the ground was hard-packed and the stones kept shifting. By noon she was sweating and frustrated, her hands blistered from the shovel. Daniel arrived in early afternoon, riding up on his grey horse instead of the wagon. He took one look at her dirt-streaked face and the scattered stones and dismounted. Predator? Got one of the hens last night. Dug under the east side. He crouched by the coop, examining the tunnel. You need to dig deeper and set posts. Stones won't hold against something determined. I know, Margaret said, more sharply than she intended. I just don't have any posts. Daniel looked at her, really looked, saw the frustration and the exhaustion and something else underneath, something that had been building for weeks. I've got posts, he said quietly. Let me get them. I can't keep taking things from you. You're not taking. I'm offering. It's the same thing. No, Daniel said, standing. It's not. Taking implies I have no choice. I'm choosing to help because I want to, because I care about you and your chickens and whether you sleep well, knowing they're safe. Margaret looked away, blinking against sudden tears she didn't want him to see. I'm tired, Daniel. Tired of needing help, tired of being the one who can't manage on her own. Nobody manages completely on their own out here. His voice was gentle. That's not weakness. That's just truth. It feels like weakness. Then you're measuring wrong. He touched her shoulder, brief and warm. I'll be back with the posts. He rode away before she could argue further. Margaret sat on the porch steps and put her face in her hands, letting the tears come now that no one was watching. She was being ridiculous, she knew, crying over a dead chicken and some fence posts. But it wasn't really about that, was it? It was about everything, about being 68 and dependent and scared that this life she'd built was fragile as spider silk, ready to tear at the first real test. Daniel returned an hour later with posts and wire and a post-hole digger. He worked without speaking, digging deep holes, setting the posts firm, stretching new wire and burying it a foot down. Margaret tried to help, but he waved her off. Just let me do this, he said. Please. So she sat and watched and tried not to feel useless. When he finished, the sun was dropping toward the mountains. The coop stood reinforced and solid, the new wire gleaming. Daniel tested it, satisfied himself it would hold, then washed his hands at the pump. Margaret had gone inside. When he knocked, she called for him to enter. She stood at the stove, stirring beans that didn't need stirring. Her face was composed, but he could see she'd been crying. It's done, he said. Should hold against anything short of a bear. Thank you. Margaret, I know, she said, still not looking at him. I know I'm being foolish. I know you're just helping. I know I should be grateful instead of angry. You're not angry at me. No, she admitted. I'm angry at myself, at being old and needing help and not being able to do everything I used to do. Daniel crossed the small room, stood beside her at the stove. Can I tell you something? She nodded. Last winter, before you came, I got sick. Fever, chills, couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. The Sorensens found me when I didn't show up in town for supplies. Mrs. Sorensen nursed me, brought me soup, changed my bedding. I hated every minute of it. Hated being weak, hated needing help, hated that I couldn't even take care of myself. Margaret looked at him. What changed? I realized that needing help sometimes didn't make me weak, it made me human. He met her eyes. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Margaret. You traveled 1,000 miles alone. You faced down a man with a gun. You built a life from nothing in a place that didn't want you. Accepting help with a chicken coop doesn't erase any of that. It feels like it does. I know, but feelings aren't always truth. Margaret turned off the stove, moved the pot aside. When she looked at Daniel now, something had shifted in her expression, vulnerability mixing with determination. "I'm scared," she said quietly. "I'm scared that I came here for one thing and found another, and now I don't know what to do with it. I'm scared that what we're building is real, and I'm scared that it's not. I'm scared I'm too old for this, that I'll wake up and you'll realize you made a mistake choosing someone with more years behind her than ahead of her." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Can I show you something?" He led her outside, to the ridge above her cabin, where the view opened up across the valley. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and red. His ranch sat to the east, buildings small with distance. Her cabin below, smoke rising from the chimney. Between them, the creek and the grass and the wide Montana sky. "When I came here 5 years ago," Daniel said, "I was running from my father's death and my partner's betrayal, and the feeling that I'd never find a place where I fit. I bought this land, and I worked it, and I told myself that being alone was easier than risking trust again, and it was easier. But it was also empty." He turned to face her. "Then you showed up, 68 years old with a trunk full of hope and a letter from a fool who couldn't see what was right in front of him. And you didn't break when he rejected you. You didn't run home. You stood on that platform, and you carried your own trunk, and you walked into the unknown, because staying where you were would have killed something important inside you." Margaret's throat tightened. "These past months," Daniel continued, "working beside you, learning who you are, it's been the first time since my father died that I've wanted to build something bigger than just my own survival. You make me want to plan for years instead of seasons. You make me laugh. You challenge me. You see me clearly and don't look away." He took her hands in his, calloused palms against calloused palms. "I don't care that you're 68. I care that you're brave and honest and kind and strong enough to ask for help when you need it. I care that when I wake up in the morning, my first thought is whether you've got enough firewood, whether your garden needs watering, whether you're safe. And I care that when I go to sleep at night, I'm grateful that you're in this valley, in that cabin, building a life that intersects with mine." Margaret felt tears spill over, hot against her cheeks. "Daniel, I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I'm just telling you the truth. I love you, Margaret Donnelly. Not despite your age, not in spite of anything, just because of who you are." The words hung in the cooling air between them. Margaret looked at this man, who'd given her shelter and chickens and fence posts and honest work, and now this, the vulnerability of complete truth. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could anymore, didn't think I had it in me, but I do. I love your steadiness and your kindness and the way you fix things without making me feel broken. I love that you see me as I am and want me anyway." Daniel pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. She pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heart beat steady and sure. They stood like that, as the sunset faded, two people who'd both been alone too long, finding in each other something neither had dared to hope for. When they pulled apart, the stars were beginning to show. Daniel cupped her face in his hands, thumbs gentle against her cheekbones. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," Margaret said. He kissed her softly, carefully, like she was something precious. She kissed him back, tasting salt from her own tears and the sweetness of something beginning instead of ending. It wasn't the desperate kiss of youth, it was richer than that, weighted with knowledge of loss and survival and the miracle of second chances. When they broke apart, both were breathing harder. Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me tonight," Margaret said. "Not for I'm not asking, for I just don't want to be alone tonight." "Neither do I," Daniel replied. They walked back to the cabin, hand in hand. Inside, Margaret lit the lamp, while Daniel built up the fire. The evening had turned cool, promising a cold night. They sat together at the small table, and Margaret poured the last of the coffee. "What happens now?" she asked. "That's up to you," Daniel said. "We can keep things as they are, separate cabins, separate lives that overlap. We can tell people, or we can keep it private. We can move fast or slow or not at all. Margaret thought about it, thought about what she wanted versus what was proper, versus what made sense. Thought about Clara Harris and the gossips and people who would always find fault. Then she thought about Daniel's face in the lamplight, the way he looked at her, the steady presence he'd been since the day they met. "I want to marry you," she said. "Not because it's proper or because people expect it, but because I want to build a life with you deliberately. I want to wake up in the same house and work the same land, and know that we chose each other honestly." Daniel's smile was slow and genuine. "I want that too. But I want to do it right, court properly, let people get used to the idea, have a real wedding where we stand up in front of the community and make promises we mean to keep." "How long?" "A few months, let the summer pass. Marry in the fall when the work slows and the weather cools." She reached across the table for his hand. "Give people time to adjust. Give us time to be certain." "I'm already certain," Daniel said, "but I'll wait as long as you need." They sat talking until the fire burned low, making plans like people do when the future suddenly opens up before them. They'd marry in October, after harvest. Margaret would move to Daniel's house. It was bigger, more practical for two people. They'd keep her cabin for guests or hire a hand if Daniel's herd grew. They'd work the land together, build something sustainable, maybe adopt a child if one needed a home, maybe just live quietly together until age took one or both of them. Around midnight, exhaustion caught up with them both. Margaret stood, swaying slightly. "You should stay," she said. "Too dark to ride home safely." "I'll sleep on the floor," Daniel said. "Don't be ridiculous. The bed's big enough for two, and we're both adults who can exercise restraint." They lay down together, fully clothed, on top of the blankets. Margaret tucked herself against Daniel's side, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and real. "Daniel? Thank you for fixing my chicken coop." He laughed quietly, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Any time. And thank you for seeing me." His arm tightened around her. "Thank you for being worth seeing." They fell asleep like that. Two people who'd both lost and survived and found, against all odds, exactly what they needed in each other. Morning came soft and golden. Margaret woke first, disoriented for a moment by the warmth beside her, then remembering. Daniel slept on, face peaceful, the lines of worry smoothed away. She watched him for a long moment, memorizing this, the beginning of something she'd thought lost forever. She rose carefully, trying not to wake him, and started coffee. The familiar morning routine grounded her, adding wood to the stove, grinding beans, setting water to boil. Outside, the chickens clucked softly, safe in their reinforced coop. The garden waited to be watered. The day spread ahead, full of ordinary work. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. Daniel stirred, opened his eyes, saw her at the stove. His smile was sleep-soft and genuine. "Morning, morning. Coffee's almost ready." He stood, stretched, ran a hand through disheveled hair. "I should get back. Cattle need checking." "I know." He crossed to her, kissed her forehead. "I'll be there by this evening. We can tell the Sorensons together if you're ready." "I'm ready." "And Margaret?" "Last night everything we said, I meant it all." "So did I." He left as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, riding toward his own ranch with a lighter posture than she'd ever seen him carry. Margaret stood on the porch and watched him go, coffee cup warm in her hands. She was 68 years old. She'd been rejected and rescued, and had found love when she'd stopped looking for it. The valley stretched around her, no longer foreign but home, full of work and purpose and a future that looked nothing like what she'd planned. It looked better. She finished her coffee, set the cup aside, and went to water her garden. The tomatoes were nearly ripe. The beans needed picking. The chickens needed feeding. Life continued in its small, necessary rhythms, but everything had changed. Margaret Donnelly, who'd come west as someone's mistake, was going to be someone's wife by choice. And that made all the difference. The months between July and October passed like water through open hands fast, but leaving something behind. Margaret and Daniel told the Sorensens first, sitting in their kitchen over coffee while Mrs. Sorensen cried. Happy tears. And Mr. Sorensen nodded once, deeply, which was the most emotion anyone had seen from him in years. Word spread through the valley the way it always did, carried on the wind and in wagons, whispered over fences and shouted across fields. The reactions varied. Some people were genuinely happy. Mrs. Chen brought Margaret a length of white silk she'd been saving, said every bride deserved something special. Mrs. Patterson organized the women to plan a proper wedding supper. Even some who'd been skeptical came around, won over by time and the evidence of their own eyes. These two worked well together, respected each other, built something solid. Clara Harris remained pointedly disapproving, but her opinion mattered less with each passing week. She'd tried to organize opposition, suggesting to the church ladies that such a marriage was unseemly and set a poor example. Mrs. Sorensen had shut that down with characteristic bluntness. The only poor example is treating consenting adults like children who need permission to live their lives. August brought the first harvest. Margaret's garden yielded more than she could use, bushels of tomatoes and beans and squash that she preserved in jars or traded in town. Daniel's cattle sold well at market, bringing cash enough to see them through winter with extra left over. They worked their separate properties but spent evenings together, sometimes at her cabin, sometimes at his house, learning each other's rhythms and habits. They discovered Daniel snored when he slept on his back. Margaret woke before dawn, no matter how late she'd stayed up. That they both preferred silence in the morning until after coffee. Daniel could make Margaret laugh with dry observations about their neighbors, and Margaret could calm Daniel's occasional temper with a single-level look. September turned the valley gold. The cottonwoods along the creek blazed yellow against blue sky. Geese flew south in ragged V formations. The air carried the first real bite of autumn, promising snow in the high country. They set the date for the first Saturday in October, when the weather would likely still be mild and the harvest complete. The wedding would be at the church, traditional and proper, with the whole community invited. Margaret insisted on that she wanted everyone to witness what they were building, wanted no whispers that they'd snuck off to marry in secret because they were ashamed. Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Sorensen helped Margaret make her dress, working from the white silk and adding Margaret's own touches, lace from a collar her mother had made, buttons from her wedding dress to her first husband, small things that connected past to present. The dress was simple but beautiful, cut to fit a woman's body rather than hide it, elegant in its refusal to pretend Margaret was something she wasn't. Daniel bought a new suit from the mercantile, dark grey wool that made his eyes look almost silver. He got his hair trimmed by the barber, his boots shined, his father's pocket watch repaired so it would keep proper time again. The week before the wedding, Daniel moved most of Margaret's belongings to his house. The furniture stayed in the cabin for whatever hand they might hire, but her personal things came east. Her trunk, her books, her good dishes, the quilt her grandmother had made. They arranged her things alongside his, making space in closets and cupboards, learning to share what they'd each held alone for years. Thursday before the wedding, Margaret stood in what was now their bedroom, looking at the bed they'd share as husband and wife. Daniel came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "Having second thoughts?" "No," she said, leaning back against him. "Just marveling that this is real. It's real. I keep expecting to wake up on that train platform, rejected and alone, and find this was all a dream I had while deciding what to do next." Daniel turned her to face him. "If it's a dream, we're both having it, and I'm not ready to wake up." She kissed him, long and deep, tasting promise and certainty. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "2 more days," Daniel said. "2 more days," Margaret agreed. Friday brought chaos. Women descended on the church to decorate Mrs. Sorensen, directing operations like a general, Mrs. Patterson arranging flowers, Mrs. Chen hanging lanterns. The men set up tables in the church hall for the supper, arguing good-naturedly about the best configuration. Children ran underfoot, excited by the disruption of routine. Margaret tried to help, but was shooed away by Mrs. Sorensen. The bride doesn't set up for her own wedding. Go home, rest. Let us handle this. So Margaret went back to Daniel's house, their house now, and sat on the porch watching the afternoon light. Daniel found her there, came out with 2 cups of coffee. "You nervous?" he asked, settling beside her. "A little," Margaret admitted. "Not about marrying you, about standing up in front of everyone, being watched, judged." "Let them watch," Daniel said. "Let them judge. We know what we're doing, and that's all that matters. You're braver than I am." "No. I've just learned that other people's opinions don't keep you warm at night or help you through hard times. But the right person beside you does both." Margaret took his hand, laced her fingers through his. They sat like that as the sun dropped lower, painting the valley in shades of amber and rust. "I'm glad it was you," she said quietly. "That day in Billings when you offered to help with my trunk. I'm glad it was you and not someone else." "So am I," Daniel replied. "Best thing I ever did, stopping to help a stubborn woman drag her whole life down the street. I wasn't that stubborn. You absolutely were. Still are." He squeezed her hand. "I love that about you." Saturday morning arrived clear and cold, frost silvering the grass. Margaret woke early, too excited and nervous to sleep. She bathed carefully, washed her hair, dried it by the stove while watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky pink and gold. Mrs. Sorensen and Mrs. Chen arrived at 9, armed with curling rods and pins and determination. They worked on Margaret's hair for an hour, creating something softer than her usual severe bun, still pinned up, but with wisps framing her face, elegant, without trying to pretend she was young. The dress went on carefully, buttons fastened one by one. Margaret looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she looked happy. The lines around her eyes crinkled with a smile, not worry. The set of her shoulders spoke confidence, not resignation. "You're beautiful," Mrs. Chen said, tears in her eyes. "Absolutely beautiful," Mrs. Sorensen agreed. "Daniel Carver is a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Margaret said. "I came here expecting nothing and found everything." They left for the church at 3. Daniel had gone earlier with the men, tradition dictating he shouldn't see her before the ceremony. The church stood white and simple against the autumn sky, its bell tower reaching upward. Wagons and horses filled the yard. People streamed inside, dressed in their best, talking and laughing. Margaret climbed down from Mrs. Sorensen's wagon with help, careful of her dress. Her hands shook slightly. Mrs. Chen noticed and took one, squeezing firmly. "Breathe," she said. "Just breathe. This is the happy part." They entered through the side door. The church was packed, every pew filled, people standing along the walls. Flowers decorated the altar, simple wildflowers and branches of golden aspen. Lanterns hung from the rafters, ready for evening. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, painting everything in warm light. Daniel stood at the front beside Reverend Michaels, Mr. Sorensen beside him as witness. When Daniel saw Margaret, his whole face changed, softened, opened, showed every bit of love he'd been carrying for months. Margaret walked down the aisle alone. She'd insisted on that too, no one to give her away because she belonged to herself, was choosing this freely, giving herself rather than being handed over. The congregation stood, but she barely noticed them. Her eyes were on Daniel. Only Daniel, standing there waiting for her with that expression that said she was exactly what he'd been hoping for. When she reached him, he held out his hand. She took it. Reverend Michaels smiled at them both. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Daniel Carver and Margaret Donnelly in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple and traditional. No elaborate vows written specially, just the old promises that had bound people together for centuries. The words felt weighty and true on Margaret's tongue, for better or worse, in sickness and health, as long as they both lived. When Reverend Michael said, "You may kiss your bride," Daniel cupped Margaret's face gently and kissed her like they were the only two people in the world. The congregation erupted in applause. They turned to face everyone, and Margaret saw the faces watching them, Mrs. Sorensen crying happily, Mrs. Chen beaming, Mrs. Patterson dabbing her eyes. The men looked pleased or amused or touched, depending on temperament. Even some who'd been skeptical were smiling now, won over by the obvious rightness of two people who fit together. Clara Harris sat in the back, face pinched, but she'd come. That was something. The reception in the church hall lasted until well past dark. Tables groaned under food. Everyone had contributed roasted chicken and beef, potatoes and vegetables, bread and pies and cakes. Someone had brought fiddles, and music filled the space. People ate and drank and danced and celebrated. Daniel danced with Margaret first, a slow waltz that gave them a moment of relative privacy in the center of the whirling crowd. "How do you feel, Mrs. Carver?" he asked. Margaret smiled at the name. "Strange. Good. Like I've become someone new while staying exactly who I am." "That's marriage," Daniel said. "Or at least, that's what I'm told. We'll figure it out together." "Yes," he agreed. "We will." They danced 3 more times. Then Margaret danced with Mr. Sorensen again, and Daniel with Mrs. Sorensen. Other couples took the floor. Children ran between the tables, stealing cookies and making mischief. Old-timers told stories. The celebration swelled and shifted and continued. Around 9 o'clock, Mrs. Patterson approached Margaret with a knowing smile. "You two should slip away while you can. Everyone's occupied, and you deserve some time alone together." Margaret felt heat rise to her face, but nodded. She found Daniel, touched his arm. He understood immediately. They made their way toward the door, trying to be inconspicuous, but Mrs. Sorensen caught them. "Oh, no, you don't, not without the proper send-off." She rallied the women, who formed a line with the men behind them. Daniel and Margaret walked between them as rice rained down, everyone laughing and calling out blessings and advice and good-natured teasing. They climbed into the wagon Daniel had decorated with ribbons and late wildflowers, and he drove them away from the church as the celebration continued behind them. The ride home was quiet, both of them drained from the day but happy. Stars emerged overhead, thick and bright. The valley spread dark and peaceful around them. "That went well," Daniel said finally. "It did," Margaret agreed. "Everyone seemed genuinely happy for us. Even Clara Harris came. Even her, though she left early. Can't please everyone." "No," Margaret said, "but we can please each other. That's enough." They reached the house, their house, and Daniel helped her down. Inside, someone had been there before them. Lanterns were lit, a fire burned in the hearth. The bed was turned down with fresh linens. Mrs. Sorensen's work, probably. Or Mrs. Chen's. A thoughtful gesture that made Margaret's eyes sting with tears. Daniel closed the door behind them, shutting out the world. They stood in the warm lamplight, husband and wife now, promises made and witnessed. "I love you," Daniel said. "I know I've said it before, but I want to say it now, here, on our wedding night. I love you, Margaret Carver." "I love you too," Margaret replied. "More than I thought possible. You gave me back something I'd lost hope for the future, belief that good things could still happen, faith that someone could see all of me and not turn away." They came together slowly, kissing with the particular tenderness of people who knew what they had was rare and precious. When they pulled apart, Daniel took her hand and led her to the bedroom. What happened next was private, intimate, theirs alone. But it was filled with gentleness and patience and the particular joy of two people choosing each other completely, without reservation, giving and receiving in equal measure. Later, much later, they lay together in the darkness, Margaret's head on Daniel's chest, his arm around her shoulders, both of them drowsy and content. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Daniel asked quietly. "When Thomas Whitfield rejected you?" "Sometimes," Margaret admitted. "Not with regret, though. With gratitude." "Gratitude? If he'd accepted me, I would have married him out of desperation, built a life of obligation and practicality. It might have been comfortable, but it wouldn't have been this." She pressed her hand over Daniel's heart. "This is a choice. This is a partnership. This is love that doesn't have an expiration date." Daniel kissed the top of her head. "No expiration date," he agreed. "Just seasons, and I want to live through all of them with you. Even when I'm 70, 80, too old to do much more than sit on the porch and complain about young people." "Especially then," Daniel said. "I'll sit beside you and complain right along with you. We'll be those old people everyone talks about, the ones who met late and loved fiercely and refused to apologize for either." Margaret smiled in the darkness. "That sounds perfect." They fell asleep like that. Two people who'd both been lost and alone, who'd found each other against all odds and built something real and lasting. Outside, the Montana night pressed close, cold and clear. Inside, warmth and love and the quiet certainty that some things, the best things, are worth waiting for. Margaret woke once, in the deep night, disoriented for a moment, before remembering where she was. Beside her, Daniel slept soundly, face peaceful. She watched him for a while, this man who'd become her husband, her partner, her home. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the lies she'd told on a telegram, the rejection on a train platform, the trunk she'd dragged through unfamiliar streets, the stranger who'd offered help without conditions. Every hard thing, every moment of doubt, every choice that had seemed desperate at the time, all of it had led here. To this moment, to this man, to this life. She'd been rejected at 68 by someone who thought her age made her worthless. She'd been chosen at 68 by someone who thought her age made her precious. The difference wasn't in the years she'd lived. The difference was in who was doing the seeing. Margaret settled back against Daniel's warmth and closed her eyes. Tomorrow they'd wake as husband and wife and begin the ordinary work of building a shared life. There would be challenges, there always were. Hard winters and failed crops and the inevitable losses that came with time. But they'd face them together, and that made all the difference. She'd come west looking for a partnership and found a love story instead. Not the kind that started with youth and beauty and uncomplicated passion. The kind that started with honesty and respect and two people brave enough to choose each other when the world said they shouldn't. And as Margaret Carver drifted back to sleep in her husband's arms, she knew with absolute certainty that some stories don't begin at the beginning. Some of them begin exactly when they're supposed to, when the people in them are finally ready to be found. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.